Okay, so let's get started. So this session, I'm going to talk a little bit about transit pricing. This is a new presentation that I'm doing this year. Usually the market trends and pricing information I give out pertain to third-party CDN services. The guys, Akamai, Limelight, Level 3, the usual guys. But because of all of the talk going on over the last 18 months over net neutrality and prioritization and interconnects and transit and peering, a lot of these terms have been thrown about. And transit in particular is something that's sort of come to the forefront. So a lot of people who have been watching what happens with net neutrality and what the regulators are doing have been hearing the word transit. A lot of them don't really know what it is. For the crowd here, obviously, you guys are probably pretty aware of transit and peering and those services, but I wanted to give out some pricing so that people could see what these services actually cost. So where do I get this information? Most of this information comes from you. It comes from customers. So I talk to customers every day, large and small, and they're buying everything from third-party CDN services, actual delivery, to transit, to wavelengths. They're doing settlement-free peering, paid peering. They're buying colocation, storage, web acceleration services. So I collect a lot of data and a lot of different services in what I'll call the CDN ecosystem. So this one happens to be about transit. I do collect transit pricing from all over the world. What I'm going to give out today is just US-based. The moment you go outside the US, transit pricing really varies. In Europe, it's pretty good, pretty stable. South America, places like you go directly to Japan or Australia, it's extremely expensive. There's a lot of variables. In the US, it's pretty level in terms of buying transit from one provider to another. There are variables, of course, which I'm going to go into. So the good news is I only have like 3 slides, so this will be nice and easy. So what is transit versus peering? In the net neutrality debate, we heard a lot of people, especially those in the media, using these terms interchangeably. They're not the same thing, transit and peering. It's really important to understand. So to think of it very simply, peering is basically 2 networks that are connecting to one another. So when you heard about the Netflix and Comcast agreement, which was called a paid interconnect, that is basically those 2 networks connecting to one another. That is not transit. Netflix actually is using less transit by going directly to Comcast and other ISPs. So transit basically means that you will agree to share traffic amongst a whole host of networks, whereas peering is 2 networks going directly together. As far as how transit is sold, there's a lot of different variables to transit in terms of how it's bundled. So you have full transit, partial transit, select routes. The main thing to take away from this is that ISPs and those who sell transit will basically create a package based on what the customer actually needs. So this morning, if you saw the keynotes from Valve and Pandora, they're buying a lot of transit as they're building out their network. As they continue to add capacity, they buy transit from a lot of providers. So a lot of companies buy transit who are delivering their own content. Think of somebody like Apple. They buy a lot of transit. Transit is bought for services more than just video. A lot of times it's thought of as you buy transit because you have to deliver video, but you're buying transit for anything you have to deliver. It's not just video content that's going over it. So this is pricing from major US providers, including AT&T, CenturyLink, Cogent, GTT, Hurricane Electric, Level 3, NTT, Verizon, and XO. It does not include pricing from Tata, Telefonica, Telesonara, or a lot of those other transit providers outside the US. In the US, there's some different transit strategies by transit providers. So for instance, somebody like AT&T is out in the market trying to sell the most expensive transit around. And the quality of the transit, from what customers tell me, is not the best. You also then have guys like Cogent who completely oversubscribe their transit and sell something that many times they can't deliver. So a lot of times you have transit pricing based on a certain level of an SLA. The thing to realize about transit pricing is that it's typically a blended price. So if you're buying transit, you're never buying it really from one provider, you're buying it from multiple providers. In some cases, it might be 6 or 7 providers. And the price you're paying from each provider might vary based on what your SLA is. So SLA is tied into pricing, as well as region, as well as how much you need. A couple things to note on this pricing I give out here. So at 10 gigs, the average rate is 90 cents per meg. But a couple things you have to realize here. You can't technically run a port at 100% capacity, or you shouldn't, let's put it that way. So let's say you're at 90%, you're already having to buy more transit above that. So you have to add some level of overflow to this. So these numbers are pretty good in terms of the average, but this doesn't necessarily mean this is what you should pay. Depends exactly what you're asking for. This is also pricing that's typically based for 1 year, sometimes 2-year terms. This pricing does not include things like access circuit, doesn't include transport. It also usually requires multiple points of interconnect. So again, a customer that's buying transit in multiple cities and multiple locations. As far as transit pricing amongst all these vendors go, it's pretty stable. Transit pricing, by my estimate, will be down 10% this year or less. For those of you who track transit pricing, that is a huge, I should say a very small reduction in pricing compared to previous years. In previous years, we saw transit falling at 40, 50, 60% each year, just like we saw back in 2009 when CDM pricing fell 45%. So transit pricing has gotten very stable, which is good. There are also some vendors, as I say in the bottom here, who are taking a really strong line in IP transit pricing, and they're walking away from deals that are too low. Level 3 in particular is very good at that, and they're focusing on selling that transit to enterprise customers or those that are willing to pay more. So transit is definitely about quality of service. It's usually about blending multiple transit providers together to get that optimal service that you want with multiple SLAs. As far as the customers that are paying for transit, the ones that I talk to say the average difference amongst most of the transit providers is about 15% up or down. Again, AT&T, the stuff I've seen with them is just, they're way more than 15%, pretty unrealistic. As far as those that I hear who do the best job in transit in the US, again, this is customers telling me this, those are really the only ones I listen to. It's really level 3, XO, those are probably the top 2. The one I get the most complaints about, not surprisingly, is Cogent. Other things about transit. I'd say the last thing is there are a lot of transit providers out there. It's a very competitive market. Netflix and some others in the industry, when it came to the net neutrality debate, like to make it sound like they had no choices in the market and this was very complex and they didn't have a lot of options for getting their traffic into ISP networks, and that's far from the truth. There are many different transit providers in the US, all providing different types of transit at different SLAs, at different price points in different cities. And it's important to remember that the ISP has no control over how the content owner is getting that content into their network. The ISP doesn't control which transit provider they use. The ISP doesn't control what type of SLA they have with a transit provider, the content owner. So the takeaway from this is basically don't believe a lot of what the companies out there are saying. It's politics more than anything else. They're all working to do what's best for their bottom line when it comes to the whole net neutrality debate and interconnection in transit. And a lot of just common sense and rational thought is not being used when it comes to the debate at all. So those are my slides. I'll put these online so everybody can see them. If you want them right away, just email me. All the emails I got from people this morning about the CDM presentations, I will get to those tonight, so I'll have links for you tonight. I have 5 links here that I thought would be really helpful. I wrote a blog post a year ago talking about what is transit, how does it work, and why is it so important. And it's pretty detailed. It talks about how networks connect to one another, why without transit the internet wouldn't exist, how transit actually works from a technical standpoint, and then I list out transit providers and pricing as well. The second one is a very interesting, very long and detailed post from Cloudflare, and they talked about how they buy transit all around the world, what they pay, what they peak at. They included a lot of charts. They talked about the benefits of transit versus peering. Very, very good and detailed from a customer. Then you have internet transit prices, historical and projected from somebody who I trust. You have an IP transit pricing service, so there are also some companies out there who have a database of transit pricing from more than 100 different locations around the world. So if you're looking for transit pricing and you want really, really granular, detailed information, you can actually go and hire companies who will do that for you. And then the last one is a research paper if you want to get even super technical, on the engineering level, which is past me, talking about pricing in the internet transit market. I forget what university did it, but it's a very good paper in terms of providing some really good technical details. So with that, I'll take like one or two questions, and then I'm going to pass it over to Alon. Yes, sir.
Yeah, the transit, for a carrier selling transit, it seems like it's fairly low on the value chain in terms of a way of playing in the CDN space. Is there a straightforward way of moving up the value chain? For example, if transit traffic is flat, if the shape of the traffic is not flat, is there a way to get value on that, or a way to change from fixed rate pricing to, instead of per megabit per second?
Sure.
Per
So
gigabyte?
what you're asking is basically, what you're saying is one thing, is transit pricing is transit as a service is pretty commoditized. To some degree that's true, but again, there's some caveats there depending on the SLA and the city you're going into and the capacity you need. So yes, to some degree I would agree with that. How do you move up the stack into more value-add services, especially if you're a CDN? Most CDNs don't sell transit. Actually, there's very few CDNs who do. Level 3, AT&T isn't a CDN because they resell Akamai. So most CDNs are not in the transit business, and most backbone providers, say a Level 3, again, very rare, aren't in the CDN business. So there's not a lot of crossover amongst those who sell transit and also CDN at the same time. If they're looking to upsell into services more than transit, they're going into things like managed services, co-location, wavelengths, other service, cloud-based services. Look at everything that like Verizon and Level 3 has been doing with security lately. So security is a big push for them. So transit is still important, but you're right. It's for some of the backbone providers, it's almost like a checkbox. They move on to other services, but they're still making a lot of revenue from transit. Some of them a good portion. Yes, sir.
Why do you think the year-over-year reduction this year is only 10% when historically it's a lot higher? Do you think that what it means for the sector?
Sure. So the question is, why is transit pricing only falling on average 10% this year compared to falling a lot more in previous years? A good example is just the fact that companies like Level 3 will walk away, which is great. So the issue we had just on the CDN side, similar to transit many years ago, was in the 2009-2010 timeframe, you had CDNs who would undercut one another just to win the business. And then they realized, oops, we're not making any money on this. And think how many CDNs today still aren't profitable. So companies have finally realized in this space that they can't give this stuff away. There has to be a walk-away point. If they can't make money on it in some way, or maybe they don't make money on that, but they upsell them on a different service that they can make money from, that they simply have to walk away. So the good news is customers ask for 0.3 of a fraction of a penny, and the transit provider says, no, I'll give you 6 or 7, but if you want 3, thanks very much, go somewhere else. So it's really just vendors being a lot better in terms of thinking of their P&L, which is great. I mean, they should have been doing that 5 years ago, 10 years ago.